Geoff Henstock lives in Adelaide and for many years has been a member of the Christadelphian Church or Ecclesia at Hyde Park. Geoff has a keen interest in history, especially where it intersects with his studies of the scriptures, and last year we discussed the importance of the French Revolution and why it's so significant for Bible students. And recently Geoff published a book entitled Palestine, Mythical Yet Real, which builds on some of the themes that were in the previous book on the French Revolution. The cover of his new book reads, "Tensions between Israelis and Palestinians dominate the way which the world relates to the Jewish state. Just as the return of the Jews to God's land is a feature of latter-day prophecies, so too is the response of the return by the Arabs in and around Israel. In this book we look at the prophetic and historical background to the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We also look at the prophecies which describe how the Palestinians and their supporters may be expected to act in the future." When Geoff published this book, which was very early in October, and the foreword is dated October 2023, he had no idea that within days the uneasy standoff between Israel and Gaza would be turned on its head. Geoff joins us to discuss the events in the Middle East from a biblical point of view. Geoff, thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations.
It's good to be here.
You published a book within days on the Middle East, and since then the Middle East has gone ablaze. The timing is amazing. When did you actually release the book?
Well, the book was actually published the day before Hamas invaded and attacked Israel. Not that we have any connection with Hamas or that it was any way coordinated. It was just a unhappy coincidence for Israel.
There's been lots of questions. I received lots of questions around what does the Bible say about the Palestinians, etc. So there's no more appropriate subject for us to be talking about. I might just at the outset, Geoff, if you don't mind, let me make the important point, and I know you'll agree with this, that our discussion today is we focus on what the Bible says. We're focused on what God's point of view is, and I suppose we're really interested in biblical prophecy and why things are happening. So it's not really a commentary on what's happening necessarily right at the moment. And certainly our hearts go out to the Israelis who were so brutally attacked on October the 7th. But I think equally to some extent, anyway, we also feel for the suffering of the men and women and children of Gaza at the moment. And we find the world finds itself in this incredibly difficult position. And so, although personally I have very little sympathy for the leaders of Hamas, we do remember those who are suffering at this time.
That's right. And there's no doubt the Palestinians suffer enormously and have done for decades, largely through poor leadership. And of course, in Hamas's case, they don't really care about their own people. But that's, there still are innocent victims of this. And, they have not been, the people who identify as Palestinians have suffered enormously. And continue to suffer, and indeed, their suffering is used as a tool for wider purposes, which is really sad.
And that's never been more evident than when Hamas won't let them move south in the Gaza Strip and won't let them move into Egypt, and Egypt doesn't want them moving to Egypt, and there's multiple levels of political sort of intrigue going on there, which we're not going to get into right now.
No, because our interest is what the Bible says. And not about the individuals and the people themselves.
Yeah. Well, I thought we'd start with the French Revolution. You and I spoke about a year and I think I looked it up, it was about a year and 3 months ago. You wrote a book on the French Revolution, and it's a great spot to start because it was the French Revolution that has so much impact on the world we see today, which most people, if they're not aware of it or haven't studied it, probably don't actually realise the impact and the reverberations that continue to happen around the world as a result of the French Revolution.
Yes, that's right. And indeed, in Bible prophecy, in the book of Revelation, it's described as an earthquake. And the world was changed forever by the French Revolution. And the forces of the French Revolution unleashed continue to change the world and affect the world, and especially in the Middle East. The forces unleashed by the French Revolution were forces to do with nationalism and national self-determination. which had never really been an issue up until that time. And then the idea that each individual racial group or national group was entitled to its own independence and its own self-determination, it just had never really been considered up until the French asserted that and threw off the monarchy and the papacy. And then those forces infected firstly Europe. So in the 19th century, there was a wave of this went through Europe, and you saw lots of destabilization and wars in Europe as new nations came together, like the Italians, united as a group, united by their Italian culture, and other nations. But it also came across into the Middle East. And initially, curiously, through Napoleon Bonaparte, who went and had a military campaign in Egypt and in what's now in the Holy Land, Israel and Palestine, in about 1799. So Napoleon had this long campaign where he was seeking to obviously progress further France's aims. It wasn't all altruistic, but in the process, he inspired this sense of and lit this sense of national pride and national self-determination in Egypt, and he offered it to the Druze in Lebanon and the Holy Land, and he also took a great interest in the Jews and their need to have their own independent state, and indeed he offered them and proposed that they should have a homeland in their original homeland in Israel, that God promised to them. He, of course, was defeated in that campaign and wasn't able to fulfill all those promises, but he'd sowed the seed.
Mm.
And as did others who who were inspired by the French Revolution's doctrine of national self-determination for individual nations and peoples who align themselves as a nation. So that in turn, without going through all the history of the 19th and 20th century, that sense of national self-determination is what is at the heart of Zionism, this movement that started in the late 19th century, where Jews said, we're not going to be safe anywhere in the world if we don't have our own homeland, where we can exist as Jews with independence. So the Zionist movement started, and that, of course, led to the Jews starting to go back to their ancient homeland in Israel, which in the 1900s was still controlled by Turkey, by the Ottoman Empire. And then in World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. It joined with the Germans and against the British, and the British attacked the Ottoman Empire through what's now called Iraq, and then up from Egypt into Palestine. And eventually the empire collapsed. And at the end of the war, we had ended up with Britain in control of the Holy Land, with a mandate from the League of Nations, which included a requirement that their administration of the Holy Land, which they called Palestine, for the first time, incidentally, that there was a place on earth with that official title called Palestine. And the League of Nations required them to facilitate a homeland for the Jews in that land. And so Jews started to come in greater numbers in the 1920s and 30s into the Holy Land, which, of course, already was populated. It was populated by a small number of Jews. It had always been there, but a very small number, but mostly by Arabs who had lived under the Ottoman Empire. And those Arabs started to become disenchanted by these Jews who were arriving, and by the British, who were now administering them as well. But they were particularly concerned about all these Jews turning up, and tensions developed between the local inhabitants, the Arab inhabitants, and the new Jewish settlers. The Jews sought to act responsibly, in a sense, by buying the land that they were settled on. They sought out to buy it with money, with help from their Jewish colleagues around the world. They bought that land that they settled on from absentee landlords, many of whom lived in Beirut or Cairo or somewhere else out of the land, but who owned that land. And much of the land they bought was quite degraded, and they worked hard to improve it. But that still didn't satisfy the concerns of the local Arabs dwelling in the land, who felt alienated and who felt threatened. Incidentally, at that same time, because the British invested so much money in the land after it had been mismanaged by the Turks for centuries, when Britain arrived in the land, there was no water supply, reticular water in Jerusalem, for instance, but they installed extensive water networks right through the country, which are still used today. They built railways and they built roads and hospitals and schools. And generally, because of the British investment and because of the Jews arriving and investing so much money, Palestine in the 1920s became a very prosperous place. And so many other Arabs living in the local area around, now called Jordan, Syria, Egypt, thought they would move their families to this new prosperous Palestine, where prospects were better, health outcomes were better, education opportunities, jobs, and so forth.
Well, I suppose the Jews that were coming to the land at that time were coming with a vision probably based on prophetical words, where the wilderness will blossom like the rose, etc. They had very high ideals for what they could achieve back in the land. And also, I guess there was the historical accounts of a land flowing with milk and honey. So there was a mandate for getting to work and fixing up a land that had been destroyed, first of all, probably by the Romans, early and after Christ, and then left desolate for 2 millennia.
Yes, that's right. And of course, there was this curious mix in the Jewish thinking of both those biblical concepts, those prophetic ideas of the land promised to them, the land of milk and honey, all of that language, all those messianic hopes of a great peaceful existence in their own homeland, promised by God, blessed by God, mixed with the humanist and secular idea of national self-determination, of independence, of freedom from persecution, which, of course, they were suffered for 2,000 years while they were when they were in dispersion. The terrible pogroms in Europe in the 19th century, early 20th century, which of course culminated in the Holocaust under the Germans and the Nazis in the 1940s. All of those things brought together in those two almost separate aspirations were sort of melded together in Zionist hopes. Whereas, of course, the Arabs who were moving to land were just doing what people have always done, looking for better opportunities for their families. And that's been the migrant story, of all time, of all history. And of course, the same forces of nationalism and a national self-determination that informed the Jews and Zionism also started to infect, in the dying days of the Ottoman Empire, the various national groups that the Ottoman Empire had subjugated for centuries. So you saw all through the Balkans, for instance, where there were people like the Serbians and the Greeks and the Romanians throwing off the yoke of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, and then, of course, in North Africa with the Egyptians and the Libyans, and in the Middle East generally, the Syrians and the Lebanese forces and the people in what's now called Iraq, all of them wanting to establish their own national identity, and that so those same forces that had been unleashed by the French Revolution affected both sides in all parties in the Middle East, and are at the heart of the tension that now exists between the Israeli state, the Jewish state of Israel, and the aspirations of the people who call themselves Palestinians, who also want a state in the same territory.
In the book, you make the connection between two which might have seen unrelated ideas, which are there in Revelation 16, where you've got the drying up of the river Euphrates and the spirit like frogs, the idea of this French Revolution. So the connection between the drying up of the Euphrates, drying up the Ottoman Empire, and the ideology of the French Revolution, and that connection there is well made in the book, as you make now.
And of course that it is curious that those two symbols are in the same prophetic symbol of the sixth vial. The drying up of the Ottoman Empire is the Euphrates River, and this spirit of nationalism. that six-fold also then goes on to tell us that these forces will lead to instability and to war, and ultimately to the great day of the Battle of Armageddon. So the Middle East is an unstable place because of these forces of nationalism. And, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen this writ large in the attack by Hamas against what they see as an occupying force in the Israelis, who they don't believe have a right to a territory in the Holy Land. And so you would have seen there were protests in Sydney only last weekend, I think it was, where the slogans were being shouted out, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And these were pro-Palestinian protesters with their slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free." So from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, all of Palestine shall be free. Their vision is obviously of one state, a Palestinian state in that territory, no Israel, no two-state solution that the world talks about. So you have these irreconcilable claims of two different people who claim the same territory, indeed the same capital city in Jerusalem, and there's not a lot of willingness to compromise.
Can I just read out a quote? I'd never read it before, I'd never seen the quote before, but you put it in the book in this context, and I found it very helpful, from the Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, who acknowledges the influence of the French Revolution in the concept of Zionism. Let me read it out, because it's a great summary of exactly what we're saying.
Yeah.
David Ben-Gurion says, Zionism derives from two sources. One is deep, irrational, lasting, independent of time and place, and as old as the Jewish people, the Messianic hope. The second source was a source of renewal and action, the fruit of realistic political thought, born of the circumstances of time and place. The Charter of Liberation enunciated the rights of man and nation which the French Revolution bequeathed on Europe. The national revival movements which developed among several European peoples, the rise of the working class, the mass migration from Europe to overseas countries, all helped to bring together the new direction in Jewish thought. The Messianic hope, which for scores of generations had worn a religious garb and had appeared as a force of nature, now it's changed religious and passive form and became a political and national form. It's exactly what you've just been saying, isn't it? And he had great insight into that.
Yes. Yeah, and that was, of course, Israel's first prime minister wrote those words, and a key figure in that period of Israel establishing its independence in 1948.
One of the great drivers of that, you'd have to say.
Yeah. So this is there's nothing new about this idea in a sense, but what I've sought to bring out in the book is that these developments are entirely as we would have expected from prophecy. And the prophecy said that at the time of the end, when the lead up to the return of Christ, there would be this period of instability, especially focused on the land of Israel, especially focused on Jerusalem. The prophet Zechariah speaks about Jerusalem being a burdensome stone for all nations. And you can see it this week, just this week. President Biden's been to Jerusalem. Prime Minister Sunak from Britain has been there. And lots of other diplomats have been there in recent weeks, trying to find solutions to this problem. And the whole world has been focused for 2 weeks now on what's happening between Israel and Hamas. You've hardly heard anything in the news about Ukraine in the last fortnight. It's suddenly disappeared off our newspapers and television screens. It's obviously still happening, but the world is focused on this tiny piece of land. It's a small country, Israel. Gaza is a small place, very small place, but Israel itself is a small country, and Jerusalem's a relatively small city. But these are the centre of the world's attention, and that's exactly what the prophets were told us to expect at this time. The world, of course, wants peace, and they want this war to end, and they don't want to escalate. But the Bible does not give us any confidence to expect that there'll be a peaceful solution this side of Christ's coming.
Before we get into the exact specific scriptures on that subject, let's just confirm what the word Palestinian actually means And when the word Palestine, I suppose, which comes before Palestinian, when was that first used?
Well, it was first used by the Romans, really, in the 2nd century, when they were so annoyed with the recalcitrant Jews that they wanted to rename the country to get rid of any reference to the Jews. So it used to be, until then, the Romans had called it Judea, and of course Israel called it Israel. But the Romans wanted a name that dissociated it entirely from the Jews, so they called it Palestina, which was actually had been coined by Herodotus, but they were the first to use it in a political sense, if you like. The name really disappeared from use largely after the Romans, and in the 19th century, people tended to refer to this area as Syria. So while we think of Syria as a discrete country, which are currently in a civil war, the area in the middle of the 19th century, people thought of Syria as being essentially all that area which we would now call Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan.
So under the Ottoman Empire, and it's, again, for those who have never sort of thought of this before, we live in a world where there's Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Iran, etc., and we just assume they've sort of been there forever because they're ancient names. But they actually essentially disappeared for quite a few years. They
weren't used, except for Egypt, they weren't even used by the Ottomans. They had other names for the various provinces. So, as of 1900, there was no Palestine. There never had been a Palestinian state or Palestine nation. And then in World War I, when the British expelled the Ottoman Empire from most of the Middle East, and as I said, they were given a mandate to administer that territory of the Holy Land. They called it Palestine. That was the first time something was called Palestine, and they issued stamps and they issued currency and passports and things with the name Palestine. But it was a British creation in that sense. Interestingly, at the time that it happened, the local Arabs living in the land repudiated the name Palestine. They did not want it to be called Palestine. They wanted it to be called Syria or Southern Syria. And they actually lobbied both the League of Nations and the British to have that name change. They refused to identify themselves as residents of Palestine. And in the 1920s and the 1930s, if anybody called themselves a Palestinian, they were a Jewish settler in Palestine. The only people who called themselves Palestinians were Jews in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. The Arabs who lived there refused to identify as Palestinians. They saw themselves as part of a wider Arab nation, and they had aspirations for a wider Arab nation, including countries that we would now call Lebanon and Syria and Jordan, for instance.
Most people would be aware of it, but for Bible students who haven't really thought of this before, they might be thinking of the word Philistine, and that may be the origin of the word. But it's true to say, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's actually no connection between the Arabs of the area and the ancient people of Philistia.
Absolutely. The Philistines were not a Semitic people. They'd come from Crete and relocated to the southern coast of Israel, what we now call the Gaza Strip, particularly, that area. They flourished for a while, but they were wiped out really by the Babylonians, and they've ceased to exist as a people. They weren't even a Semitic people, whereas the Arabs, like the Jews, are Semitic people. So there's no racial or historical connection between the Philistines, who've disappeared over 2,000 years ago, and the people who now call themselves Palestinians, or indeed any Arabs at all. They're not an Arab people. So while there's some attempts sometimes to draw connections to the Philistines, there is no ethnic or any kind of historical or ethnic relationship between them. Completely different people. And the Arabs, the people who now call themselves Palestinians, those who are living in the West Bank and Gaza, are Arabs, and like the Arabs that inhabit Egypt and Syria and Jordan, for instance. So at the end of the British mandate, the British found Palestine increasingly hard to govern, because there was open warfare essentially between the Jewish settlers and the the local Arabs. So they handed it over to the new United Nations, who came to a decision that the solution to the problems in the Holy Land was to partition the country, to set up two separate states, one for Arabs and one for Jews. And if they had their own territory and their own borders, they could then live their own lives, not be constantly in conflict. That was the hope of the United Nations. The Arabs rejected that model out of hand. They just refused to accept a partition of the land. They had an all or nothing sort of approach. The Jews, of course, weren't thrilled about the partition proposal, but they were more pragmatic, and they decided that half was better than none. So getting half a country was better than getting none at all. So they signed up to the idea of the partition, but the Arabs completely refused to acknowledge it and to accept it. The British left in rather a hurry in 1948, and the Israelis declared an independent state of Israel, which, by the way, was the first time no one knew until the day they pronounced it that they would call the state Israel. It had been thought it might be called Palestine, but it wasn't. It was called Israel. And it was only then that the Jewish settlers in the Holy Land stopped calling themselves Palestinians and started calling themselves Israelis. The Arabs, in the local Arabs, were encouraged by the neighbouring Arab states of like Syria and Jordan and Egypt to resist the Jewish state. And in fact, there was the day independence was declared, the Arab neighbours invaded in an attempt to snuff out the Jewish state of Israel. And there was a war of independence, which was fought for the next year or so until there was an armistice agreed. And Israel had certain borders that were established, which did not include the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. The Gaza Strip had been conquered by Egypt and was held by Egypt after 1948. And the West Bank was conquered by Jordan and held by Jordan after 1948. And then there was constant tension between the Arabs and enemies of Israel and Israel. And then in 1967, there was another war when Israel expelled Egypt from the Gaza Strip and took it over themselves and occupied it. And they expelled Jordan from the West Bank and occupied the West Bank. And that's what we have today. And they speak about the occupied Palestinian territories. They were occupied by Jordan and Egypt from 1948 to 1967, and then they've been occupied by Israel since.
I think it's worth mentioning, and you sort of touched on it before, how that as Israel was preparing before 1948, they were buying land. So literally, dollars and cents, going and buying land. They bought land for hospitals, they bought land for settlements, etc., off Arabs that were willing to sell, quite legitimate and so on. And Martin Gilbert, in his book on Israel, goes into this in some detail, actually details the areas that were purchased by Jewish neighbourhoods and groups, and they set up kibbutzes and things like that. Where it gets a bit murky, of course, is in 1948, when Israel declares themselves a nation, and then as a result of the war, so many Arab families and communities fled and left vacant lands behind them and didn't return. And so they were then taken over by, I guess, other Jewish settlements and Jewish immigrants that then came into the land. So it did end up with this mishmash of sort of legitimately purchased land with other land that was vacated
and appropriated
by Arabs who had moved.
They appropriated it. And that has undoubtedly caused a good deal of tension. And there were, of course, Israeli-owned properties that ended up in the Arabs' camp after the war as well. So the same thing happened on both sides, and that's not to minimise the suffering of the individuals affected whose houses or land were taken or lost. But certainly that's exacerbated the problems. And of course, many of those Arabs who did flee the country, they were encouraged to flee, sometimes with the promise that once the Arab armies triumphed, they were going to be allowed back. Well, of course, the Arab armies didn't triumph, so they ended up in these squalid camps in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and Gaza.
and Gaza. And I think that's probably worth mentioning. That's the origin of what effectively was an immigrant camp in Gaza.
And in the West Bank. And these are terrible places. There's no doubt about it. They are dreadful ghettos that have been allowed to fester now for 75 years in most cases, with no attempt to resettle these people and to bring an end to their suffering. Whereas, there's been lots of refugees in the 20th century. In all the wars in the 20th century, there were lots of refugees, and all the other refugee groups have been resettled. Maybe not where they wanted to be, perhaps, because they didn't have an ability to go home, but they've been resettled, with the exception of those who fled from the Holy Land, from their homes in what's now Israel. They have been allowed to continue, and indeed, there's now 3 and 4 generations in these camps. People who've never set foot in Israel, but who still claim a right to return because they've been born in these refugee camps where their fathers or their grandfathers came in 1948. And it's a terrible suffering and a terrible ongoing problem that there's no desire to fix, because whatever you've got them as a suffering group, you've got this people for whom we can evoke sympathy and who, tug at the heartstrings of the world, who want to see peace and harmony in that part of the world.
So we find ourselves in an almost unsolvable situation, and obviously when Israel, was it 2004, Israel gave Gaza sort of the opportunity to self-determine. Yes, it was sort of this half-hearted sort of halfway house arrangement where there's at least some attempt to sort of come to some mitigation, I suppose.
Well, because, yes, that's right. Israel evacuated Gaza in 2004 and handed it over to the Palestinian Authority, which was essentially controlled by the PLO. There were elections then, shortly afterwards, and the Hamas came to some power, and the PLO do not like Hamas either. There's a lot of tension and conflict between those groups. So there was essentially a civil war in Gaza when the Hamas asserted their authority over the PLO and indeed slaughtered many of the PLO operatives who were trying to administer Gaza, and essentially became, a separate territory of, not controlled by the Palestinian Authority, which has its office at its base in Ramallah in the West Bank under President Mahmoud Abbas. But Hamas then took over and administered Gaza in a way that's not been very helpful to the local residents. And there's, Hamas is absolutely committed to the obliteration of Israel. Their founding documents, their charter, specifically calls for the destruction of Israel, and they do not recognise the idea of a two-state solution. The PLO officially say they support a two-state solution, so does Israel, incidentally. But in fact, the PLO's charter still also calls for the elimination of Israel. They've not changed their own founding documents. And there is, the truth is there is no real commitment to a two-state solution. The two-state solution, of course, is based on the idea that if the Jews are a distinct ethnic group in the land, they have a right to a national homeland. And likewise, then, the Palestinians should have a right to their own homeland. The logic of that, though, is somewhat flawed, because the Palestinians are not a distinct ethnic or cultural group. They themselves have acknowledged that.
They're part of the Arab group that currently have Jordan right through Iraq, Iran, right through Syria.
Yeah. And of course, the fact that they're Arabs, of course, doesn't mean that they should go and live in those countries necessarily. Many of them have their origins in the land. There are many Arabs, of course, who are happy to be Israeli citizens. There are Arab members of the Israeli parliament. There are Arabs who serve on the Supreme Court in Israel. Arab residents of Israel have the same rights as anybody else in Israel. And, everybody, certainly in the Western world, we'd expect that to be the case. Just as if an Arab came to live in Australia, he would be entitled to the same rights as everybody else has. And they do. There are many Arab people living in Australia. But there is no such thing as a separate Palestinian nation. So, and as I said, I demonstrate in the book, that has been stated repeatedly by people connected with the Palestinians themselves. Members of the PLO executive have said that in so many words. It is a fiction that was created in the 20th century as part of this conflict between the Arabs and the Jews in the land, to essentially provide an equivalence, if you like, and the world has signed up to this idea. Almost every nation, Australia, the United Nations, as I said, even Israel, now signs up to the idea of a two-state solution. But there is no willingness on the part of the Palestinians, the PLO, Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad organization, which is also another radical group based in Gaza, Hezbollah, which is a group in Lebanon, which has sympathies and links to Hamas. None of these people really accept the right of Israel. And of course, Hamas and Hezbollah are funded by Iran. And Iran also openly calls for the destruction of Israel and the elimination of the Jewish state. And they are using Hamas and Hezbollah as their proxies in maintaining their fight against Israel. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why the world is so nervous at the moment about the conflict in Israel and Gaza escalating, because it could involve Iran and Israel fighting each other. And that would then potentially spread to other nations and become a very major problem for the world, both in terms of the humanitarian issues, but also with the potential disruption to oil supplies and the like.
Well, this is the world we find ourselves in. I guess the big question for us is, how does that fit with biblical prophecies? We're all pretty aware of the prophecies that Israel returns to the land. They're going to have their own homeland. And before Messiah returns, there's going to be an invasion of the Northern Confederacy, etc. So we won't get into that in detail now, because we take that as understood. But the big question is, well, seeing that these Palestinians are quite the thorn in the side of Israel, to quote an Old Testament scripture at the moment, are they mentioned in Scripture? And I think, as you've indicated in the book, the answer is yes. So can we have a look at a couple of the prophecies?
Yes. So firstly, in relation to Gaza, there's a prophecy in Joel 3, which talks about that northern invasion at the time of the end, which has this obscure reference to the fact that Israel, that when the invader comes, they'll get support from the area which we would now identify with the Gaza Strip, the area that the Philistines originally occupied.
Can I read that? Joel 3, 4-6. What are you to me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all the regions of Philistia? Are you paying me back for something? If you are paying me back, I will return your payment on your head, swiftly and speedily. For you have taken my silver and my gold, and you've carried my rich treasures into your temples. You have sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks in order to remove them far from their own border. That's Joel 3, 4-6.
So you notice three areas are named there: Tyre and Sidon, which are, of course, in southern Lebanon, the heartland of Hezbollah, where Hezbollah is almost a state within a state, in southern Lebanon, in that area of Tyre and Sidon, and the coast of Philistia, which is essentially roughly the Gaza Strip, and incidentally, towns in Israel like Ashkelon, which has been so much in the news in recent weeks. So you see those two areas, which are not actually connected contiguously, they're two separate areas on either side of Israel, are shown as being aggressors at the time of this northern invasion. And they create problems for Israel. And so you see that's exactly what we've got at the moment, the tension with Gaza, and indeed the fear that Hezbollah, who has been lobbing some missiles into Israel and has been sort of threatening the northern border. So those two areas are there at the time is currently showing that same hostility that Joel speaks about at the time of the end. And indeed, it goes on to talk about ethnic cleansing, the taking of people and getting rid of them out of the land. And that, of course, is an objective of these people. They want to take over the land and they want the Jews out. So that you can see the same sentiments are there that we've been hearing in the last few weeks and will unfold over the next few weeks.
So do you have any sense of what it means when it says they have taken my children and taken them to the Grecians, or sold the people to the Grecians? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a fairly cryptic expression, and how the Greeks come to be involved is curious. What I think is a likely scenario is that in recent years, Israel has developed a very strong relationship with Greece and with Cyprus, or at least the Greek part of Cyprus. And that's got to do with a whole lot of, geopolitical reasons, but it's also got to do with the potential for gas pipeline from the Israeli gas fields off the coast through Cyprus and Egypt to Europe. So there's growing strong ties between Greece and Israel. And it may be, for instance, that at the time of that awful northern invasion, when Israel is overcome by the Gogian host, and people do have to flee, that maybe because of their friendship, the Greeks will be willing to accept these refugees from the land when it's being ethnically cleansed of Jews. Now that's a speculation, but it is curious that Greece should be mentioned in that prophecy. And in recent years, the last 10 years, there's been this growing friendship between Israel and Greece. And you could see a willingness for Greece to get involved, perhaps at that time, if that were to continue. So that's my suggestion, but that's somewhat speculative.
Yeah.
But it is curious that all these alignments should be happening in accordance with those words.
Yeah. Well, the most extraordinary thing we need to note, and I'm sure everyone's noticed it, and that is the fact that where we're seeing the hot points in Israel today is exactly those areas that have been referenced in the prophecies of Joel, and it's not the only one. There are others.
Yes, that's right. There's one in Ezekiel 28 which largely correlates. It focuses mainly on southern Lebanon, but it's certainly consistent in terms of its language and its sentiment. And that prophecy is useful because it also says that this aggravation that these people will cause, and you used the term earlier of being thorns in their side, which is the language that the Bible uses there, will continue until Christ establishes himself as ruler in Jerusalem. So what that tells us is that we should expect to see this sort of aggravation on Israel's borders, and we ought not to expect it to cease before Christ returns. It's going to be an ongoing tension that will only be resolved by Christ at his coming. And that's interesting because, Israel obviously wants peace. They've been pursuing peace treaties for decades now. They've got one with Egypt and one with Jordan. And in the last 3 years, they've developed what they call the Abraham Accords with various Arab nations. Israel wants to live in peace with its neighbours, largely because life's easier and also you can make more money that way. Israel's a very wealthy country, and it will become wealthier if it could live in a world of peace where it didn't have to spend so much money on its army and could export its expertise and its skills to its local neighbours like Saudi Arabia, and indeed ultimately, anywhere, Syria, Turkey, anywhere in the region they could develop friendships with. So Israel has no desire to be in a perpetual state of war, but it will be, because the prophets say that it will be that part of the world will be a source of tension, dragging all the nations in. Zechariah 14 speaks about all nations being drawn into tensions over Israel and Jerusalem. Ezekiel 38 speaks about a vast array of nations coming to invade Israel at the time of the end.
Well, I was amazed when I read the book, Geoff, I've got to say. It was one of my questions. I got to the end of the book and I thought, I have one question left, and that is how do we understand the reference in Ezekiel 38 to the land dwelling securely, and indeed a land without walls and or villages without walls. Yeah,
walls and gates. Yeah,
and walls and gates, and it's got the biggest wall on earth now.
But interestingly, I heard Mr. Netanyahu some time ago making the point to somebody, yes, we built this wall, but you can't build a wall against missiles.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
How hard is the wall going to be before it stops a missile? And indeed, you then say, oh, well, they've developed their Iron Dome missile defense system, which they have, and it's a very advanced and sophisticated system. But as we saw 2 weeks ago, if you fire enough missiles, you can overwhelm even the Iron Dome. And many of the missiles got through because there were just so many of them. We know, for instance, that Hezbollah has 100,000 at least missiles installed in southern Lebanon. So Israel does have a wall and lots of gates. Every country has passport and border controls. There's nothing new about that.
There's sort of this tension, is there? I might just read a couple of verses if you don't mind. So Zechariah 12 you mentioned, let me read it. Zechariah 12 verse 2, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. On that day when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all nations who try to injure them. Those who try to move her will injure themselves. But as we've been saying, let me use a quote from Ezekiel 38 verse 10. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall come to pass that at the same time when things shall come into thy mind, speaking about the mind of Gog, thou shalt think an evil thought, and thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates, to take a spoil, to take a prey, to turn thy hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods and dwell in the midst of the land. Beautiful prophecy of the return of Israel. Incredibly accurate description of what Israel would be like when when the people return. Of course, these prophecies have been understood for many years. Even the reference to the unwalled villages has often been, the kibbutzim system has been thought of there as perhaps that's a reference to that.
Yeah.
But again, as we're saying, we've got sort of a bit of a conflict here in sort of our understanding, because you would never say that since 1948, as we've discussed, Israel has been under almost constant threat from the locals and remains so even in an escalated form today. So there seems to be, and let me give a couple of alternatives as to how we might understand it. The first one, which I think is one I've always preferred, without having thought it through, to be honest, necessarily, was there must be at some stage before Christ returns some settling down of the normalisation of the arrangements, whether it be at some sort of two-state solution or not. That's probably too much, but anyway, some sort of peace treaty or ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinians. That's option number one. Option number two, which some people have mentioned, and that is that this is actually a reference to the time after the kingdom is set up, and they sort of change the order that the Ezekiel 38 happens in. And so the Gogian force is the nation that comes against Israel after Messiah is there in Israel. And that's, for those who understand traditional Ezekiel 38 in a traditional way, that seems absurd, and it certainly doesn't reflect the text there. But remember, there is going to be a force that comes against Israel and Messiah after the kingdom is set up. And Psalm 2 is a great descriptor of that event. But I certainly personally discount that quite out of hand, because it's not how Ezekiel 38 presents it at all. So I'm back to the peace treaty, or perhaps an alternative, which you suggest in the book, which I found quite helpful.
And I think if I look at Israel, I can't see prospects of that sort of harmonious, peaceful existence anytime soon. There's no willingness on the part of the key players for that. So you have to say to yourself, well, what does it mean then? Well, the language used about dwelling without walls and bars and gates, or whatever the translation you use is, but that language, that concept, is clearly, in my view, figurative, because all nations have border controls of some kind. So what's it really saying? And the language is used elsewhere in the Bible particularly the example I use in the book is a prophecy in Jeremiah about the city of Hatzor, which Jeremiah says, felt like it was dwelling safely, securely, having neither walls nor gates, but you're about to be destroyed. And they were. The prophecy was correct. The interesting thing about that is Hatzor is one of the great archaeological sites in the Middle East today. And if you go to Hatzor, one of the great archaeological relics that they've dug up, which is there for people to see and is highlighted, is the incredibly elaborate gate system they had in the wall of their city. So Jeremiah spoke about Hatzor as being, having neither walls nor gates and dwelling securely, but they did in fact have a massive wall and a most sophisticated gate. So clearly he wasn't using the language literally. He was using it in the sense of that sense of self-assuredness, that we're here and we're here to stay and no one's going to move us, and you can huff and you can puff, but we're not going anywhere, and we are more than able to meet any threat that comes to us. And I think that's the state of Israel today. That is exactly how they act. They believe that they are secure, that no one's, yes, you can threaten them. They were attacked 2 weeks ago today. They had a terrible experience of being caught on the hop by hostile forces. But they're going to hit back, and they're not going anywhere. They're not moving an inch, and they're not willing to compromise. And that self-assuredness, that cockiness of we're here and we're here to stay, and you can't threaten us. You can threaten us, but you can't succeed in scaring us off. We will make a stand and stand our ground. That's the attitude that's expressed in that language. That's the sense of security they have. They know, they're constantly having terrorist outrages, people turning up at bus stops and stabbing people or whatever. It happens all around the world. It happened in Belgium during the week, and another one in France. So these sorts of things happen, but they're not being intimidated. That sense of confidence, of assuredness, the cockiness that you hear in their language, and you've been hearing it from their military leaders this week as they prepare for their ground invasion of Gaza to, in their words, to wipe out Hamas. Now, I don't doubt they'll do their best, but there's other forces. Hamas is just one of the forces that are opposed to them, and the mindset that's opposed to them. So there will be this ongoing tension right through to the time of Christ, but Israel is not going to be intimidated by it. That's what that language says to me, and I think you can demonstrate it from its use elsewhere in the Bible.
I found it all very helpful, Geoff, and what it says to me is what we're seeing in the world today, and what we've been talking about today in particular, Israel in the land. We've got tensions on the mountains of Israel, that is the West Bank. We've got tensions in Gaza, tensions in Lebanon, and that's exactly what Bible prophecy has been telling us. That's exactly what you should be seeing just as our Lord is about to return. So it's incredibly inspiring and encouraging.
Yes, and and all nations are caught up in it, whether they want to be or not. And we've seen that in Australia. There was a protest yesterday on the road to Pine Gap. There's protests again this weekend in Sydney and other cities, and all around the world. The world is, you can't get away from this. It's, it ought to be a backwater. It's a small country, but it occupies and dominates the world's news and attention.
We live in the last days, Geoff, and I think discussing these things I find very helpful and reassuring. And we pray for the peace of Jerusalem and pray for the return of Christ when this sort of conflict and trouble in the world will be put aside, and we look forward to a time of peace and prosperity.
Yes.
The world's ruled in righteousness, and there won't be such things happening.
Yeah, and when all the people of the Middle East, Arab and Jew, will find peace and prosperity and security at last.
Geoff, thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations.
Thank you, and I hope people find that interesting.
I'm sure they will.
Good, thanks.